former Utah Governor John Huntsman.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, Speaker Newt Gingrich.
Great to see you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So what do you guys want to talk about?
There are no eggs. There are no eggs. How can we function with no eggs here?
Exactly. In a coin toss out back, it was determined that we would allow Mr. Speaker, you won the coin toss, I believe. So Speaker Gingrich will open this evening with a 3-minute opening, and after that, Governor, we will give you 3 moments for your introductory remarks, and we will get started. Mr. Speaker.
Well, let me just say, first of all, that I really appreciate St. A's hosting this. I think it's going to be an interesting hour and a half. I knew Governor Huntsman back when he was governor, and we talked health policy in his office, and he was doing a tremendous job there. Calista and I were very honored because he and Mary Kay hosted us, I think, the second day they were in Beijing, and they were still unpacking, and they allowed us to come over and spend some time. And the governor is fluent in Chinese and has served both in Singapore and Beijing. And the reason I give you that background is you very seldom have an opportunity to have 2 people who have a passionate commitment to America's role in the world and who have experiences that allow them to have the kind of conversation we potentially can have here. So St. A's has done a wonderful thing by bringing us here. I believe that one of the great weaknesses of the campaign up to now, the debates up to now, has been the absence of a serious discussion about the nature of the world market, the nature of those challenges we face, and the nature of America's role in that world. And I think that today, here, we have a chance to really have a dialogue and to take on some ideas, and with your help, to really cover some ground. So from trade to diplomacy to national security to the very identity of our country, I think we'll cover a lot of ground this afternoon. I think I can tell you on my side, I think it's going to be very interesting, and I think it'll go places that neither of us could predict right this minute, just because having 2 people who care this much chat leads you to places that you don't have talking points. Your consultants didn't figure it out. You didn't do focus groups. You're just talking from your own experience about the nature of the world.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Governor Huntsman.
Pat, it's an honor to be with you. It's terrific to be with so many folks from St. A's here. I can't tell you what an honor it is to be here, particularly reflecting upon the mock caucus that was held last week. I understand we won, so I feel particularly comforted in here. No, you're not supposed to do that. Not supposed to do that. But I just want to tell the Speaker what an honor it is to be with him. And what a joy it was to be able to have Calista and you in our place in Beijing, to be able to talk about U.S.-China relations at a time when we were both on the ground thinking in those terms. I also want to tell you all that I hope you understand my English, because I've acquired this real New Hampshire accent, having spent so much time here. We just did our 120th public event in the state today, and I have thoroughly enjoyed getting around and making new friends and engaging in what is, I think, the most significant political event in the run-up to choosing our next president. That takes us to where we are today. And I am honored and thrilled to be part of this discussion. As for me, I think our foreign policy and national security posture going forward really needs to be based on an expression and extension of our value system. And as for me, I've kind of packaged them around a few things that are going to guide everything that I do and all of the decisions that I make. And it really breaks down to, first, fixing our core. Because if we don't have a strong core in this country, and today it is weak and it is fading, then we're not able to project the values that we are famous for in the world. Democracy, liberty, human rights, and free markets. I say first and foremost, if we want an effective national security strategy and foreign policy, we've got to fix our core. We have no choice. And second, I want a foreign policy that really leads by economics. When was the last time we had a foreign policy that put economics first? Third, we have an ongoing challenge called terror for as far as the eye can see into the 21st century. That's not going away anytime soon. And we need a posture, a structure, and a set of national security priorities that allows us to engage realistically. And finally, I want the world to know what it means to be a friend and ally of the United States. And it's been a long time since we reminded the world what it really means to be a friend and ally of the United States, what is implicit, what is explicit in that. And I want to drive those home as President of the United States. So thank you all for being here and part of it and giving us this great audience.
All right, opening remarks done. Let's begin with the interesting subject of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Governor Huntsman, you're going to start us on this. You have about 5, but feel free to take a little less or a little more if that's what you need.
Let me just begin with this. We are 10 years into the war on terror. We have given this effort our all as a nation. In some cases, families have given the ultimate sacrifice, and it's to them that we pay respects and give sincere gratitude. But I say we have achieved some very important outcomes in Afghanistan, and I believe it's time for us to come home and to recognize what the mission today going forward is. It isn't about nation building, particularly when this nation so desperately needs to be built. It's not a counterinsurgency that we ought to be focused on. It's a counter-terror effort ongoing, and it will be for some time in Southwest Asia. So when I look at Afghanistan, I say, first, we've been able to run the Taliban from power. That was a pretty important outcome. Number 2, we've been able to have free elections going back to 2004. Number 3, we've been able to uproot and upend al-Qaeda, who now are in sanctuaries in Waziristan and in subsidiaries beyond. And finally, we've been able to kill Osama bin Laden. And I say, I want to articulate as president what it means to have achieved those very important outcomes. And beyond that, I say it's time for us to bring our men and women home. I want to leave behind in Afghanistan realizing that the threat ongoing is a counter-terror threat. I want to make sure that we have on the ground, not 100,000 troops, we don't need 100,000 troops on the ground, nation building for the most part. We do need a counter-terror effort. And I want to make sure we have the ability to raise and collect tactical intelligence. I want to make sure that we have a well-outfitted and trained special forces capability, even beyond what we have today. And I want to make sure we have some ongoing commitment to training of the Afghan National Army, knowing full well that we've done a pretty good job in capacity building. We've been able to help in establishing more of a robust civil society. But I'm always reminded of a conversation I had with Hamid Karzai, and I'm sure you've had some, Mr. Speaker, where in his office in Kabul, he sat a couple of us down, and he said, I'm not sure you in the West fully understand what it means to be president of a country like mine. You see, we're a tribal country, and I have a hard time even going back to my native region of Kandahar because I'm not respected as a leader. And I started reflecting upon that reality, what it means to run a tribal country in his situation. So, we've been able to build infrastructure. We've been able to expand rule of law to some extent. We've been able to help in fortifying civil society. I think we've done the best that we can do, and I think we should be proud of what we've done. But now it's time to move on. It is time to come home recognizing that we have an ongoing commitment on the counter-terror side, which takes me to Pakistan. I think we need to recognize that Pakistan, sadly, is nothing more than a transactional relationship for the United States. I wish we could say that it were more. And again, it's kind of evolved with the highest of expectations. I mean, you look back, July of 1971, Henry Kissinger passed through Islamabad on a secret mission to China. We forget sometimes that it was Pakistan that actually opened the way to China for us. He got sick, apparently, went to the Aga Khan Summer Palace, and then flew on that PIA plane and showed up in Beijing. Those were the good days with Pakistan. And then, of course, after the Soviet invasion, we ran our operations through Pakistan. The aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal in the 80s then made for a very complex mix. And today we have a very complicated domestic set of circumstances in Pakistan with the Islamist group, with the Ministry of Defense, which runs ISI, probably the most powerful body in the country. And of course, then your secular government. And a very young demographic with 180 million people, the youngest in South Asia, a thriving madrasa movement which gives rise to anti-Americanism there. You have to stop and say, for all of the aid money that we put into Pakistan, are we seen in a better light as a country? The answer is no. We are not seen in a better light in terms of how the Pakistani people see Americans. So I say let's recognize it for what it is. It's a transactional relationship. We do have interests in Pakistan. It is a nuclear country. There are over 100 nukes in that country, and we want to make sure that it doesn't give rise to a proliferation problem. Two, they need to cooperate with us in the area of counterterrorism. We need access for purposes of intelligence collection and execution of certain missions. So I want to make sure that our relationship ongoing recognizes the contours of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. It is what it is. It's a transactional relationship at best. Any aid money that goes in there, if we can afford any at all, and we have to look very carefully at that, should be tied very specifically to outcomes and to careful cooperation on the part of the Pakistani government. But in the end, Pakistan is not going to succeed until they can shore up their civil society, until they can somehow take power of that country away from the military and the ISI and give it to their civilian government, which they've not been able to do.
That was great, Governor. 5 minutes, almost exactly. Mr. Speaker, your thoughts? That was very good.
I'm not sure I can meet his timing skills.
Well, you were Speaker, of course.
Yeah. Well, as Speaker, I usually allowed myself to speak as long as I thought it was useful. So, when I was a junior member, they had a very strict 1-minute rule, which Tip O'Neill enforced against me relentlessly. I was at a National Institutes of Health conference a few years ago, and the then head of the National Institutes of Health, who was an Algerian-born American and a great doctor, made the comment that we now live in a world where you can have a Four Seasons hotel in a third world country, and 1 block away you can have a slum where people have come in from the jungle. And so you have people who fly in who are used to Western models of vaccination and Western models of sanitation, and the person right down the street is in fact living in a totally different world. That we have compressed hundreds of centuries, or centuries, several hundred years, into being neighbors by the difference in developmental rates. And in a sense, that's part of what Karzai was saying in Afghanistan. This is a much harder problem than anybody in official Washington in either party is willing to deal with. Let me give you the most obvious example. If you had come to me a year ago and said, where do you think bin Laden is? I would have said, my guess would be that he is in Waziristan in northwest Pakistan, probably in a cave, probably deeply entrenched. He might have left somehow miraculously and gotten to Somalia, but it's not likely. So that would have been my guess. If you had said to me, oh no, he's been living for at least 5 years in a large compound in a military city about 1 mile from the Pakistan National Defense University, I would have said that would only be possible if a substantial part of the Pakistani intelligence service was protecting him. Now, when we found him and we went in and killed him, the first reaction of the Pakistani government wasn't, oh, I'm so glad you got rid of this man you've been hunting for a decade. The first reaction was to be angry at the people in Pakistan who had helped us. Now, I think if you're going to be realistic, you have to really stop and ask yourself, what are the underlying lessons of all this? And what it tells me is that across the region, we have a much deeper, much more profound problem than we think we do. And that there's a real question whether we are in the business ultimately of having a transactional relationship with an Afghan government whose president finds it advantageous to occasionally attack us in order to float on top of the tribes, or whether we're in the business of modernity, which will ultimately break down the tribes, which is a much longer process and is not a military process. It's an economic process, it's an information process, it's a lot of things, but it's not primarily military. I look at Iraq, for example, which in the years since we liberated the country from Saddam, the number of Christians has dropped from 1,200,000 to 500,000. It's very hard for me to see that as a success story. I look at the degree to which we have no idea what's going to come out in Libya, Egypt, Syria, Tunisia. We were last night with some friends who had served in the intelligence agency for a long time. In 1947, because we had a theory of the Cold War, we went into France and Italy covertly. We supported everybody who was not communist. And we defeated the Soviet effort to take over both countries. I mean, if they had won those two campaigns, we'd be in a totally different world today. We don't have a theory today of what it is we're doing. We're randomly using our forces, we're randomly using predators, but we don't have any kind of clear understanding of this fight. The Obama administration just issued instructions that terrorism training should not involve any reference to Islam. Well, it'd be like talking about the Cold War and not mentioning communists. I mean, how do you describe radical Islamists if you're not allowed to say radical Islamist? It's a willful denial of reality on a scale that is breathtaking. So I think you've got to go to the basics and start over and say, all right, we're not stronger than we were 10 years ago. We're weaker economically. We have lost our young men and women. We have lost money. And it's hard for me to argue that we're any safer than we were 10 years ago. As Governor Huntsman said, the Pakistanis keep producing nuclear weapons. We have no way of knowing whether or not the Pakistanis actually can control those weapons in a crisis. The Iranians are every month get a little closer to getting a nuclear weapon. In my judgment, they will use them. I mean, a movement which has been at war with us since 1979 and which just in recent weeks broke international law once again by occupying the British embassy is a movement that you have to be very cautious of. And I'll just close with this thought. So I want all of you to think about how serious this is. A movement which recruits its own children to learn how to be suicide bombers and sends them into a bus station or into a mall or into a restaurant to blow themselves up in order to kill you is a movement which with nuclear weapons would use them in a heartbeat because there's no effective deterrent. And I think this is a much deeper, longer crisis, and I think that it's one we have to confront very, very deeply and come up with a totally new strategic understanding of what we're going to be doing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a little over 5, but not bad. Governor Huntsman, anything to add to that? Anything further before we leave this topic?
I would just say that we have to be very careful as a nation in identifying what our core national security interests are in that region of the world. I think we have to do it based upon where we sit with Pakistan, based on our relationship today, where we are with Afghanistan. And I think when you get right down to it, our nation's interests really do include nuclear weapons in Pakistan, the implications of those getting lost or falling victim to proliferation. I think number two, I think a big potential problem for us is Pakistan as a failed nation state. And as you look the world over, I would have to say that Pakistan is a candidate for possible failed nation state status, probably second only to North Korea. And if that were to happen, the turmoil in South Asia would be imponderable at this point. And would our interests be at stake? Of course they would be. And third, being a training ground for terrorism is something that we must work with them with. So as we analyze Pakistan, as we try to put in perspective what it means to get along with the Pakistani government, the Pakistani people, and as we kind of formulate what our aid support will be in non-government organization, our diplomatic engagement, I think we have to take very seriously these three areas because they are in America's interests. And it means we're going to have to shore up some of the relationships in the region. I think the relationship with India is a prime example of a relationship that is waiting to broaden and expand its economic, military, intelligence links with the United States. it gives us another platform, another set of eyes and ears from which we can see Pakistan. It gives us a little bit of a hedge in the region, which I think is good. It allows us to recognize and to complement, in a sense, a nation state that shares many of our values. The largest democracy in the world with 1 billion people. Is it lively and colorful during election time in India? Absolutely it is. They share our values. And I think that's an important thing for us to recognize. And as the tumult continues to play out and the level of uncertainty in Pakistan, and indeed with Afghanistan, and as the various players begin to position themselves to fill what likely will be a void, Russia will want to play some role. Pakistan will follow India, who will go in and probably support the Northern Alliance. The Chinese will look and say, wonder what on earth is going on. And they, for the first time then, the Chinese will say, we've never had this kind of situation on our periphery without the United States being involved in securing all of us. And they, for the first time, the Chinese will have to wake up and say, do we get involved? And that will be a very important moment in Chinese decision-making, because for them it will be a first. They've never involved themselves in anything like that. But for us, and in securing our interests in the region, looking out for those 3 primary areas, shoring up a relationship with India, I think long-term is going to be what this nation needs in the region.
Mr. Speaker, any last thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, I'd say we have 4 immediate needs. 2 sort of echo what the governor began this with. We need an American energy policy that dramatically expands both our independence and our capacity to be a reserve source of energy. The Iranians announced today, for example, that they are engaged in an exercise to practice closing the Straits of Hormuz. We need to recognize how precarious the entire industrial world is if, in fact, we end up in a mess in the Persian Gulf. And only an American energy policy that maximizes our production meets that. Second, I strongly concur with the governor. If we are not the arsenal of democracy, there's no stability on the planet. You can't be the arsenal of democracy unless you have an arsenal. We have to rebuild our manufacturing capability. Third, I think one of the lessons of Pakistan and Iraq are we need to liberate our intelligence capabilities. We today rely on foreign countries to provide us far too much of our intelligence, and that means in many cases they're not necessarily giving us the truth, they're giving us what they want us to believe. And lastly, I would say we actually need to have a national conversation and a national dialogue about creating a strategy for all of radical Islamism. Because if you go back and look at 9/11, it's not a single nation state. The fact is that these forces in the age of the internet are growing everywhere. For example, the madrasas in Pakistan are largely funded by the Saudis. And the Saudis have been the leading purveyor of hatred around the planet as it relates to the Sunni wing of Islam, just as the Iranians are the leading portrayer of terrorism on the Shia side. And I think that requires us to really think about what is our overall strategy for dealing with the problem, not just one country at a time.
Thank you. I promised you, no buzzers, no bells, no horns. That was pretty good.
And we're grateful.
Well, listen, we are too. Let's move on to another interesting topic in foreign affairs. Mr. Gingrich, you start on this one. It is the issue of Iran. And if you would spend about 5 minutes, sir, giving us your thoughts on that country.
Yeah, I'll gain back some of my earlier lost time.
Okay.
I think the Iranian thing is very simple. Are you willing to accept them having nuclear weapons or not willing to accept them nuclear weapons? I mean, everything else becomes secondary. You have to first decide if, after you're done dancing, you're going to accept them having nuclear weapons, you have one set of possible strategies. If you're determined that they not have nuclear weapons, I believe you have to ultimately be for regime change, because there's no practical scenario in which you can take out their weapon systems without them rebuilding them. And you can't go back in and take them out every 4 years because the world in the long run won't tolerate it. And furthermore, we don't know. I see all these studies. I was asked to come in and read the various reports on WMD in Iraq after it got to be a big mess. And I read the original reports. You know, the CIA was years off in estimating when the Soviets would get an atomic bomb. They were very far off on the Pakistani atomic bomb. This idea that somehow we have magically accurate intelligence and therefore we have lots of extra time, or we don't have extra time, or is it 6 months or is it a year? This is baloney. The truth is they have hardened their systems. They have put them underground. They took the logical conclusion from the Israeli raid on Osirak in 1981, and they said, gosh, if we build buildings above ground, the Americans will find them and kill them. So they have huge underground facilities. Some of the underground facilities are under mosques. Some of them are in the middle of cities. I mean, the idea that you're going to wage a bombing campaign that accurately takes out all of the Iranian nuclear program, I think is a fantasy. It would be a gigantic mess with enormous collateral civilian casualties. And so I think you've either got to say to the Iranians, you dismantle your program, or we start down the road towards steps that will stop you. And the first steps are serious economic steps, serious political and psychological steps and diplomatic steps. And by serious, I mean, for example, they import 40% of their gasoline. They produce lots of oil. They only have one refinery. They literally have to import 40% of their gasoline. Serious steps would include giving communications equipment to every dissident. Clist and I did a movie on Pope John Paul II and another movie on Ronald Reagan, both of which show you the joint alliance of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Pope John Paul II to defeat the Soviet Empire. Now, we didn't wage a general war against the Soviet Union, but we crowded it on every front. We consciously adopted strategies to undermine and break it. I'll close with this thought, because I think, again, it's one of the reasons I've been using clear language recently in a way to try to get people's attention. Mark Bowden, who wrote Black Hawk Down, wrote a book called Guest of the Ayatollah, which is about the hostage crisis of 1979-1980. The subtitle of the book is Iran's First Shots in the War Against America. This is 1979. Their senior leadership has seen themselves as being at war with us for over 30 years. We keep finding excuses. They've killed Americans in Lebanon. They've killed Americans at Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia. We now believe they trained and supplied al-Qaeda for the embassy bombings in East Africa. They've had a consistent pattern of being our enemies. And we've had a consistent pattern of denying it, apologizing it, walking away from it. I believe we cannot allow them to have a nuclear weapon. Therefore, I believe we have to be for regime change. And I would adopt a strategy that was very clear and said, unless they agree to unilaterally disarm their entire system, we are going to replace their regime. We're ideally going to do it non-militarily, but we are not going to tolerate an Iranian nuclear weapon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Governor Huntsman.
I agree with a lot of what the Speaker has put forward on Iran. First of all, let me say that I believe Iran is the transcendent issue of this decade from a foreign policy standpoint. So I like to say, in terms of the big picture, Afghanistan is not our future. Iraq is not our future. The future of this country really is how well prepared we are to meet the 21st century competitive challenges. And they're economic, and they're educational, and they're going to play out largely over the Pacific Ocean in countries that I've lived in, having lived overseas 4 times. But if you were then to step back from that grand picture, you'd have to say that the transcendent issue of this decade, the transcendent threat from a foreign policy standpoint, is Iran. We forget that we had a much different relationship with Iran pre-1979. So is there an element of society that actually would constitute a reservoir of goodwill toward the United States? Perhaps. I think we missed a huge opportunity with the so-called Persian Spring in 2009. Huge opportunity missed by this president. We go into Libya, where arguably we have no real definable national security interests. We scratch our heads over Syria, and we lecture Israel all the while. And I say, during all of this, the centrifuges continue to spin in Iran. They're moving inexorably toward nuclear status. I believe the mullahs in Tehran have already made a decision for themselves that they want to be a nuclear power. I think it's been very instructive for them to look at North Korea and to say the North Koreans have a few crude nuclear devices. They're essentially untouchable. And they've looked at Libya, and they've said Libya's taken a different journey. They gave up their program in exchange for international friendship and relationships. And I think they've concluded that they want the credibility, the leverage that a nuclear weapon gets them. So the centrifuges spin, and ultimately it's going to go from enough low-enriched product to enough high-enriched product out of which to make a weapon. They'll have enough fissile material. And then the United States is going to have to be ready to, I think, confront the reality of what to do. And in this case, you then have to say, as the Speaker mentioned, the question for all of us in this country is, can we live with a nuclear Iran? I think the Chinese have already decided they can live with a nuclear Iran. I think the Russians are less certain about that. I think they care more about proliferation concerns than, say, the Chinese do. And if you can live with a nuclear Iran, then you've got to conclude that Saudi Arabia is going to go nuclear. Turkey, probably Egypt, although we don't know who's in charge, largely the backbone of which would be military leadership. And I think that then presents a scenario that is unsustainable in the Near East in terms of the real proliferation concerns, particularly the language that I think is very real that has been used by the government in Tehran against Israel. So I say if you can't live with a nuclear Iran, and I can't, then you have to say what to do. And I think all options are on the table. And I do believe that we're going to have a discussion with Israel. I don't know when it's going to happen, beyond just the consultations we're having now. I'd say in the next 1 to 3 years. And we better be prepared for that conversation, because it's going to go something like this. We have enough intel, leads us to believe there's enough fissile material out of which a crude bomb can be made. Are you with us? And I think we better then be able to remind the world what it means to be a friend and ally with the United States, what the alliance with Israel actually means. There's an economic component, there's a security component to it, and there's a values component to it. And I think there's a regional stability component that we need to then stand up and be prepared to address. So I would have to agree, all options need to be on the table. And the mullahs in Tehran need to know that all options are on the table and that there is zero ambiguity in terms of what we are prepared to do, and no blue sky in terms of where we stand with Israel.
It's hard to have a discussion about Iran without some discussion about Israel, Mr. Speaker. Can you touch on that as well? And again, additional thoughts as well. But clearly, the Iranians have made rather clear their feelings about Israel.
Let me build a little bit on what the governor said, the ambassador, from his ambassador's days. If you're the Chinese and you think to yourself, okay, the Iranians can get a nuclear weapon, they might take out Israel. Is that a primary interest of Beijing? No. They might mess up the Americans. Would that be okay? Yes. I mean, the Chinese don't see any existential threat to them from the Iranians. Just they're not committed to a worldwide stability. They're committed to a gradually weakened America. They want the world market to exist. They're not stupid. But these are not primary threats to them. That's not part of their value system. What I tell people about the Iranian thing is basically 2 steps. If you are an Israeli prime minister and you remember the Holocaust and you think about the death of millions of Jews, and you look at the idea that 2 or 3 nuclear weapons is a Holocaust. Israel's a very small country, very urban population. No more than 3 nuclear weapons would be required to equal a Holocaust. And you say to yourself, am I going to take the risk of presiding over the second Holocaust, which would mean, for all practical purposes, virtually the end of Judaism on the planet? They're not going to take the risk. So then the question becomes real simple. You call the American president and you say, I have these 2 planning choices. If you will help me, I'll go conventional. If you don't help me, I'm using as many nuclear missiles as I need to take out the Iranians. So you decide whether or not you want to be the guy who sat to one side while a nuclear war occurred with all the consequences. Or you help me. But what I won't do is I will not allow Israel to be subjected to the threat of a Holocaust. And then the American president's going to have a big decision to make. And I think this is I agree with Governor Huntsman, this is a not very far down the road decision. My first official meeting with a foreign leader after I became Speaker, I was not yet sworn in, it was in December. And Speaker Foley called me and said that Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was coming to the States, would I see him? And in December of '94, we sat down, and he, former Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Force, Prime Minister, and he said to me, Iran is an existential threat to Israel, and we cannot deal with it by ourselves. It is too big. The reason I am so desperately trying to reach a deal with the Palestinians is to clear the space to focus on Iran. Now, that was 17 years ago. And we still haven't cleared the space to deal directly with Iran. And the clock is running, and I think I agree with the formulation the governor had. This is the biggest national security threat of the next 10 years. China is a challenge in the long run, and not necessarily a threat, but a challenge, largely economic and technological. Iran is the problem of the near future.
Any last words, Governor, before we move on?
I would just say there will be talk about additional sanctions with respect to the relationship with Iran. My sense is that will do no good at all. The president will go out and talk about layer after layer of sanctions. It's been tried for a while. It won't work because the mullahs in Tehran have already decided they want to go nuclear. And the Chinese and the Russians, who are the key members of the UN Security Council, aren't going to do it. They're not going to work with us. So you've got sanctions in place right now. In order for the sanctions to have any impact whatsoever beyond that which has already been done, would be to go down to the annex portion of the sanctions and to be able to list specific names, trading houses, companies, banks, that then you're willing to sanction. China's not going to go that far. They like the flowery hortatory language, and the Russians to some extent do as well. When you get down to the specifics of citing individuals, that's just not going to happen. So I think we all need to conclude that this is going to be the United States doing it our way at the end of the day, which isn't all bad. I think we work better. We work better when left to our own devices. With respect to Israel, when you look longer term, at some point we all have to figure out how to improve the region. We're kind of in tactical mode right now. You look at the Middle East, you say, we got Israel as our centerpiece relationship. We want to make sure we remind the world what it means to be a friend and ally and maximize the values that are inherent in that bilateral relationship. Then beyond that, you say there's Iran, the transcendent challenge of the decade, and Syria, because they're a subsidiary and on the brink of disaster today anyway, the conduit through which you get a lot of material and support for Hamas and Hezbollah, a regime now with Assad that doesn't have much more than the support of some in Lebanon and Iran. And you have to say, we're in tactical thinking mode. Longer term, how do you put the pieces back together again? And I think that's where the U.S.-Israel relationship is going to become very important. Why? Because we have a free trade agreement with Israel. It's the oldest we have as a nation, goes back to 1975. And so why do we have, just take Iran off the table for now, why the Arab Spring? Why the uncertainty playing out, not unlike the end of the Ottoman Empire in, say, 1919 or the events of 1948? It is that way because you have two things at play, I do believe. One, you have the problem of long-standing dictators who just wouldn't go away, whether Tunisia, Egypt, Libya. And second, you had real pockets of discontent. You had no economic growth, no opportunity, no possibility for jobs in parts of North Africa and the Middle East. So what to do? You rise up, you join these causes to take on the long-standing dictator. And I think longer term, the only way we're going to begin putting some of these pieces back together is by doing what this country has not done in a very long time, and that's beginning to pull the levers of economic power. We don't do trade agreements anymore. We need to. We don't engage on investment in international economic relationships anymore. I think Israel provides a very powerful opportunity to take that free trade agreement, to expand it beyond, and have it spill over and impact some of the region that today we see through a lens that is very troubling. But longer term, we're going to have to, as people, say, how do we begin putting those pieces back together? How do we bring stability and predictability and opportunity to people who today don't have them?
Governor, you began the transition to our next subject, so I'm going to let you continue. You've got this one first. It really is, the question is the Arab Spring, which became the Arab Summer, which became the Arab Fall and the Arab Winter. Let's talk about the Arab Spring as a movement, as you just alluded, and sort of where does it leave us from here? We still have problems, obviously. What's next? Where do we go? And as you've just begun to allude, what can we see our role being in this as these countries begin to stand up to some of the very dictators you just talked about?
Well, I think we're in a period of great uncertainty right now in the Middle East. You can't force history. I mean, the speaker knows that as a great historian. You can't force these events. They're going to have to play out. And I think we make a mistake as a nation by intervening and trying to pick winners before we know who's going to be up and who's down. I mean, the events following the end of the Ottoman Empire, although it was a different lay of the land, different powers involved, the era of the period of uncertainty is going to play out. But, as it plays out, the rest of the world is taking note in very interesting ways. Long-standing dictators, lack of economic opportunity. Guess who's paying attention to that? The Chinese are paying attention to that. When I was living over in Beijing, they were frightened. They were concerned about what this might mean in terms of long-standing dictators and regions of China that weren't getting enough economic lift They were concerned. They had their domestic security bureaus on high alert. They were looking out for anyone who might be gathering under the banner of Jasmine Revolution. They even banned the U.S. ambassador's name from the internet, which I thought was pretty cool at the time, because I was associated with American values. And so the world is watching all of this play out. I think we have to be very careful how we handle it. We have to look out for groups that share our values, but then I think we have to make sure they don't become something that is inconsistent with our values longer term. And that's the challenge of picking winners early on. So I was against the United States doing what they did in Libya. I know Newt and I might disagree a little bit on that. I couldn't see a definable or discernible American national security interest there. The events are going to play out. They would have played out as they did anyway. With Syria, I see it a little differently, because it is a conduit, a pipeline that is used by Iran for complete activities of destabilization in the region. And I say that makes it a national security issue, and one that we need to pay some attention to. So I think we need to be cautious about how this transformation occurs. I think we have to be a little careful about who we end up supporting and throwing our bets behind. And I do know this. While the breeze of change is blowing and the great uncertainty is there, we do have certainty in the relationship with Israel. And I go right back to that anchor that we have in the region, that we need to somehow remind the world once again what it means to be a friend and ally of the United States, to allow the world to understand that there is no blue sky between the United States and Israel. We're not going to throw pre-cooked outcomes on the table like the president did in terms of the border. We can't force, we can't push the peace process. Why would they even want to sit down and negotiate any kind of peace agreement with Egypt, showing no signs of who's going to be up or who's going to be down? You can't expect in an uncertain environment to make any progress at all, and we shouldn't force it. We should be a facilitator. We should look at what happened after the Madrid Accord of 2001 or 91, and the follow-on then with Oslo in 98, and say we have the context for a two-state solution here. You can't force it. Let's take the advice of the leadership of Israel before we know when it's right to maybe play a helpful, nurturing or facilitating role.
Mr. Speaker, the Arab Spring, you've had some thoughts about a number of issues in the last couple of days with regard to Israel and the Middle East. Your thoughts? Do you agree with the governor?
Well, the comments I've made about the Palestinians, I think, are different than the Arab Spring. I think there are three large pieces that we could learn from about the Arab Spring. The first was that the way that the Obama administration got rid of Mubarak shook everybody. You know, the governor's made a very important point that people have to have a sense that if you're an ally of the United States, that there's some staying power. Mubarak had been our ally for a very long time. He had covered for us under very difficult circumstances. The Iraq campaign probably couldn't have occurred without Mubarak. They had consistently helped us in the Israeli-Palestinian environment. The Israelis had not had to defend their southern border for a very long time and had not worried about the Sinai. And Obama dumped him in an unceremonious way. We were out for Reagan's 100th birthday and we're talking to Secretary Schultz, who was very concerned about the whole pattern of the way that this administration deals with people, because he said, everybody else watches you. And so you're the Saudis, and you watch, when an American president dumps an ally unceremoniously, other allies start thinking, so can I rely on you? How long, you know, and there are ways to have gotten him to retire with dignity that would not have indicated a capricious willingness to dump somebody who had taken a lot of heat and who had helped us a great deal for years. So that's the first thing you got to think about as you go through these things. Second, it's a real problem to have an intelligence system as crippled as ours is by the way laws have evolved since 1975. Because the truth is, we don't know who in Benghazi, which was the city producing the anti-Gaddafi rebellion, and which was the leading city producing anti-American fighters for Iraq. This number two source of anti-American fighters coming out of outside of Iraq was Libya, after Saudi Arabia. We have no idea who these people are. Our intelligence isn't good enough. And so and this is true across the whole region. So the Congress has so crippled the intelligence system that we sit in our embassies talking to the local intelligence people who tell us what they want us to know for their reasons. It's an enormous problem. The third difficulty is one the governor alluded to, which is if you don't have a strategic plan, if you're not trying to broadly shape the culture, you go back and look at what we did after World War II in Japan, in Korea, in Europe. We had a very, very large and comprehensive effort. Things like the Fulbright scholarships, et cetera. I mean, you could imagine a strategy that says, we want to maximize the liberation of women. We want to maximize entrepreneurship and economic growth. We want to maximize people who understand modernity. We want to so what would you do? You'd recreate the U.S. Information Agency as a freestanding agency. You'd have a process of translating lots of books into Arabic, because there are very few books translated into Arabic worldwide. You'd maximize opportunity for college scholarships to come to the U.S. so that you'd have a generation growing up that understands something other than Sharia and other than madrasas and other than limited life. And you'd have a 10 or 15 or 20-year worldview. I always tell people, my dad served in Korea in 1953. And when we visited a few years ago, and I know you've been there many times, South Korea is an amazing country. It's self-governing, it's independent, it has a very lively press. It's, I think, the 13th or 14th wealthiest country in the world. Didn't happen overnight. And as late as 1969, it had the same per capita income as Ghana. And yet, suddenly it took off. And Americans ought to be very proud of that. And you can't do that if you're sending troops out and risking their lives every day. So to have the long view, you've got to find non-military engagements that are sustainable, that on a bipartisan basis you can explain to the American people, that lead them to decide this is a commitment they're willing to make.
Governor, anything else you'd like to add to this? I do want to get to our next point, but if you've got a word or two more.
Well, I can see my daughter nodding off over there, which means I've already gone off too long anyway.
It's a good sign. All right, let's move on in the interest of your daughter. I want to get to our next...
By the way, she's also my senior foreign policy advisor, so that's not a good thing.
She also picked the coin toss for you. I saw that backstage. Let's move to another important point, which you've touched on so far.
I just want to say in her defense, she was nodding off while I spoke. So...
I want to talk a little bit about all of this and how all of this relates to something you both have talked a lot about, which Republicans talk about all the time, which is reducing the debt, which is a huge burden on our country, but doing that in a way that does not destabilize America's place in the world and our foreign interests, and particularly our military. So the debt and defense spending, the relationship between both of those. Mr. Speaker, you go first on this one.
Well, I think there are three or four things. First of all, you ought to decide what threatens you in the world and what your goals are in the world, and you ought to build strategies and structures to meet that. And that's the first priority of government. I mean, if you're not safe, if you're not being defended, if you're not strong enough that no enemy decides to attack you, you're about to have the most expensive decision you've made. So I am deeply opposed to the sequester, which was a purely political gimmick to enable the Congress and the President to slide through July because they didn't have the creative ability to get anything positive done. But the idea that you're going to cut defense by a random $500 billion because it was a political deal strikes me as just the worst possible way to approach this. So you ought to spend what you have to. Now, in 1981, I helped found the Military Reform Caucus during the Reagan defense buildup. And the reason was I told people I'm a hawk, but I'm a cheap hawk. And I really think, I've been a big advocate of Strong America Now, which is a group that wants to apply Lean Six Sigma to government. I think you ought to apply it to the Defense Department, too. You ought to apply it to the State Department, too. You ought to apply it to the Agency for International Development also. There's no reason to justify waste in defense because it's in a uniform or because it has defense on it. And when you think about how rapidly iPads and iPhones and other things change today, and you look at a weapons system process that takes 12 to 15 to 20 years, you know it's wrong. And so there's a lot of stuff we can shrink and flatten. But I would start by saying, create the defense system you need, create the foreign policy you need, then let's talk about how we get to a balanced budget. You want to do it as inexpensively as you can, but you want to make sure it gets done. On getting to a balanced budget, the folks who are for Strong America Now believe you can save about $500 billion a year by modernizing the government. I think that's probably at a minimum, the correct number. I think there are ways you can reform the entitlements. We've proposed, for example, the right of every younger American to have a personal Social Security savings account along the Chilean and Galveston, Texas models. You have a huge long out-year impact on spending. I think there are steps you can take on Medicaid and on Medicare that have huge out-year effects on spending. So I would not look on, I would never say that the richest country in the world can't sustain what it needs to do in foreign and defense policy, but I would say we ought to do it as efficiently as we can, and that's not the key to balancing the federal budget. Obama didn't radically increase the defense budget. His $2 trillion a year budget deficit is vastly more domestic spending and entitlements than it is defense.
Governor.
With two boys in the U.S. Navy, I think about their future and our whole defense posture. It puts it kind of in a different context altogether. First, debt. When we have $15 trillion in debt and rising, it's got to be seen as something other than just debt. I believe it's got to be seen as something akin to a national security problem, because you don't grow. When you're 70% debt to GDP, it has a sluggish impact on your ability to get on your feet. And if you want to see what coming attractions are on the debt side, you know, as a former senior negotiator with Japan 10 years ago, I mean, look, they're entering their third lost decade of economic growth because of structural barriers and debt. Look around the bend in Europe and take a look at Italy, 120% debt to GDP, Greece, 170% debt to GDP. So I would have to say that the debt issue is such that all spending programs, everything's got to be on the table. And for folks to say that, you know, Medicare, you know, shouldn't be there, we're going to have to, you know, make it a sacred cow. Nonsense. We've hit the point in this country where we can't afford that luxury anymore. Everything's got to be on the table. So you look at defense and $700 billion almost. And I say if we can't find some efficiencies there, we're spending more than the rest of the world combined. We're spending more than we did during the height of the Cold War. I think for us, it's a function of priorities. Not just the money we spend, but a function of priorities. And I agree with Newt completely, and that is whatever we do on the defense spending side must follow a strategy. And that strategy must be part of keeping us safe. That's the bottom line. And then keeping us safe has to, of course, be consistent with being the second decade in the 21st century. So I would say a strategy that really does, again, when I kind of listed the four components of a foreign policy that I would follow right up front. Fixing our core. We got to get our economy right in order to project any power at all, to pay the bills in terms of our defense systems. Second, having an economy that leads our foreign policy. You know, it used to break my heart sitting, you know, in Beijing, the second largest embassy in the world. You know, I'd look at neighboring Afghanistan. We'd have 100,000 troops there. The Chinese would go in and take the mining concession. And I said, there's something wrong with this picture. You know, we secure the environment and people benefit economically from it. I want to make sure we have a strategy, a foreign policy strategy, a national security strategy that is driven by economics. And third, counterterrorism. I think that's going to have a huge impact on our defense priorities, on our spending, on our deployment patterns, on our national security structure going forward. As far as the eye can see into the 21st century, we've got a problem called terror. And it's not going away anytime soon. And it's going to be in Southwest Asia. It's going to be in the Horn of Africa. It's going to be in Yemen. It's going to be in Mindanao, Philippines. It's going to be under the name Abu Sayyaf in Southeast Asia. And we have to be real about that. And that means not only the way we spend, the way we prioritize our defense programs, but also the friends and allies that we reach out to, I think will be part of that as well. But then finally, let me just say, as we follow strategy that is consistent with being second decade into the 21st century, I think we have to be smart enough to say there's a whole lot of waste in the procurement and purchasing side of the Pentagon. And so if you just stop to ponder where we were, you know, post-World War II, where we had, I think, Newt, it was about an 1,100 ship Navy. I think we had 115 aircraft carriers. We had a NAV-C that was 1,000 people strong, producing about 100 ships per year. And I look at where we are today. We have a NAV-C that I think is up to 25,000 people, producing about 5 or 6 ships a year. And I say, you know, you look at the cost of an F-18, for example, compare and contrast it to an F-4 Skyhawk or an F-4 Phantom from the Vietnam era. And there's been a cost escalation that isn't consistent with real materials and labor. And so we've got something happening on the procurement side the red tape, the numbers involved, the purchasing practices, whether that's, competitive or sole source. But I think there's a huge opportunity for this country to lift up the hood of the car and to make some fixes there that I think are going to be much better for our people longer term, as we all know we need to find greater efficiencies in government.
Mr. Speaker, any final word on debt and defense? And if you do, one question. We've been through this sort of, I assume you would call it a false premise, that in order to decrease the budget deficit, we have to somehow deal with defense. We got to deal with a lot of things, but what are your thoughts on that as you...
Well, let me say two things. I mean, first, I think you ought to put defense spending and State Department and Agency for International Development spending under the same test you'd put anything else. That is, once you decide you want to do something. When I was a kid, my dad, who spent 27 years in the Army, was stationed for a while in Stuttgart, Germany. And we were there to stop the Soviet Union from occupying West Germany. And the Soviets were right down the road in East Germany. There is no Soviet Union. There is no East Germany. We still have 7th Army headquarters in Stuttgart. Now, you have to ask yourself a question. Why are we sitting there? I mean, other than habit, the Africa headquarters, the African Command headquarters, is in Stuttgart. Now, I used to teach geography. I mean, there's a point where you look at these guys and you say, give me a break. Okay, so let me start with that. Second, I think that it's very important to pick up on what the governor said about procurement. I mean, if we used to have a policy that said you flew something and then we decided to buy it. We now have a policy that says we'd like to study it for 10 years to decide whether or not to study it for 10 years, to decide whether or not we could think about it for 10 years. I mean, you have a National Aeronautics and Space Administration which has currently got no vehicles that can get to the space station. Has it occurred to you to wonder what the billions are for and what the thousands of employees mean? They sit around and they think space. I mean, do you know how hard it is to get to a period where we spend this much money and don't have a vehicle that gets into space? And it's this entire model the governor referenced, which is thousands and thousands of people who write reports for each other to read about what they might do someday if they bought something. It's the opposite of a sound system. And I think there could be a very deep overhaul, which would actually make the Defense Department and the State Department and AID function better. We would get better defense with a thoroughly modernized, leaner management system than we have today.
Let me just say, finally on this point, as you look at the map, at last count, 700 installations, to Newt's point, 700 installations in 60 countries around the world. 50,000 troops still in Germany and 20 installations. You have to say, the Russians aren't coming anymore. At some point, we've got to recognize that. And we also have to recognize the rise of the Asia-Pacific theater, the PACOM AOR. We're probably not looking at a massive land war anytime soon. We're looking more at an asymmetric threat. And as you've got the rise of the Asia-Pacific region, that's 3/4 of our trade flows through those waters. That's the rising militaries of the 21st century. So whatever we focus on, and it's not just, nobody's being isolationist about it, it's just being smart. It's being a realist about where we have installations that are a carryover of the George Kennan view of the world, containment from 1946, as compared and contrasted to where we need to be today.
I'm going to, you started us into a nice segue, Governor, because we're coming into your wheelhouse here on China and the Pacific Rim. We have about time for one more question or so on this format. If we pick up the pace a little, not a lot, we might get to it. I'll leave that to you guys. Governor, you start on this one.
Oh, yeah, I've already put his daughter to sleep once. I think it's really unfair to force me into these kind of decisions. Go ahead. I'll try to be quicker, faster.
Remember, I'm not with the press. I'm a volunteer.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay.
In any event, Governor Huntsman, you started speaking a little bit about China. Our next topic is China and the Pacific Rim. Let's talk a little bit as a general topic. And, if we cut a minute or two off here, we might get into our next topic.
Let's just say that, the relationship of the 21st century will be the U.S.-China relationship. There's no question about that. So looking more at the PACOM, the Pacific, Asia-Pacific operating area. I think for us, whether it's militarily or whether it's from an economic policy standpoint, is going to be something we really need to know a lot about. It'd be good to have a president who actually understood that part. So a couple of things that we need to be mindful of when we think about China that will inform us as we develop a relationship that I think is workable over time. A couple of things playing out. One, we have elections next year, so I've heard. The Chinese, they don't do elections, they have leadership changes. And when you stop to ponder the nature of the changes that are about to take place at the 18th Party Congress, you stop to say that probably 65 to 70% of the top 200 leaders are going to be turning over. You stop to look at the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which is the kind of the largest board of directors body. 7 of the 9 members are going to be turning over in that body. I think the most sweeping changes since 1949. And then you have to say, with that will be the rise to power of the 5th generation. You know, I know members of the 5th generation. I knew members of the 4th, some in the 3rd. They're a hubristic, nationalistic generation. They don't remember necessarily the events from 1960 to 1964, the Great Leap Forward. They don't remember, or barely, the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 76. They've been terribly informed, though, by 30 years of 8, 9, 10% economic growth. Blue sky. Their time has arrived. They can do no wrong. And I think that's going to present a challenge all by itself for the United States, because unlike the earlier generation that lived through the Cultural Revolution and saw China at its most chaotic, they were humbled by that, and they never wanted to see that again. You've got a different generation that has a much different worldview. That should inform all of our thinking about how we proceed. Second, what should be our objectives? 2 things that I think we need to cite as objectives. One, China's economy is going down from a GDP growth standpoint. Inflation is up. Costs of production in the southern manufacturing zones of Guangzhou are on the rise 10 to 15% per year. There will be political uncertainty because of the unemployment. When you have unemployment that rises, you've got, already in a country that's going from 800 million farmers to 200 million farmers. How'd you like to have a country with 600 million redundant farmers on your hands? And they begin to become part of that large itinerant workforce that roams the countryside, 100 million strong, and puts stresses and strains on the city centers. That's destabilizing. That's the nightmare scenario for the Communist Party. And they say, we're going to do anything we can to avoid that. I'm not sure they can. But significant to where we sit today, the investment that always kind of just knee-jerk drops itself into China for manufacturing purposes is going to say the risk profile is a little different. It is something that I might not want to bet on longer term. I want to find another market. That takes us right here to our home base. We would be crazy in this country if we didn't recognize the tectonic shifts that were happening in the macroeconomic environment and say, we're going to do what we need to do in this country to fix our competitive environment and win that investment right here at home. And so, where I was earlier today, and Peterborough and other places in New Hampshire, to think that we can bring to life some of the old brick buildings that lost the energy and the vitality because manufacturing, we can win that back if we're smart about it. Because that investment dollar, if you stop to think that capital is a coward, is going to flee risk wherever it is and find a safe haven somewhere. And if you're a risky environment is going to flee, go elsewhere, China's going to become more of a risky environment. We need to embark on a strategy that allows us to win back our manufacturing base, because I believe this country is on the cusp of a manufacturing renaissance if we do it right. And that's going to come out of China's hide. 2, we need a real dialogue with the Chinese that allows us to engage on the issues that make up our relationship. It's a terribly large and complicated relationship, one that includes North Korea, Iran, Burma, Pakistan, South China Sea issues, global economic rebalancing. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And so the U.S. government goes in, we hit one issue at a time without fully realizing that every issue kind of impacts every other issue. The Chinese see them in total. They're the greatest long-term strategic thinkers in the world. We are the best short-term tactical thinkers in the world. And we somehow have to mesh these 2 cultures and figure out how to make it work. And 40 years now of the relationship, Richard Nixon stepped off that 707, February of 1972, shook the hand of Zhou Enlai, a relationship that changed that dynamic considerably and the world. And we have to figure out how to develop a dialogue that is somewhat similar to what we did in the days with the Soviet Union. Not that there's a Cold War atmosphere, but we regularize the dialogue. It's not, on the margins of APEC or on the margins of the G20 meeting or some other major confab. It's dedicated to a relationship that now is going to lead the world in terms of importance economically and from a security standpoint. And we need to get from them a better sense of what their strategic intentions are in the region. We need to get a better sense of them, where they're spending their defense dollars and what their priorities are. We know very little about that. We have to sit down in those kinds of meetings and solve some of our trade issues, because every issue you work on with the Chinese, it tends to impact some other issue. You can't do it in isolation. So I would like to say that after they have leadership changes wrapped up in 2012, they'll need 1 year to consolidate power, which is typically what happens after you have new leaders in position in China. Xi Jinping will rise to the presidency. Li Keqiang will rise as the premier. They'll have a year to consolidate power. I say by 2013, 2014, we will have some running room, 2014 to say 2016, 2017, in which we can actually begin to put a relationship with the Chinese together, where they'll have greater flexibility without politics playing out. The Chinese used to love to tell me when I was over there, 我们中国也有政治. In China, we have politics too, by the way. We always complain about our system. They have politics too. So they'll be devoid of politics 2013, and we'll have an ability for 2 to 3 years under the right kind of leadership to forge a relationship then that will allow this kind of dialogue that I believe will bring stability and opportunity to the world and to our people. And we should count on that.
Mr. Speaker.
Well, let me say, first of all, that Governor Huntsman and Ambassador Huntsman knows far more about China than I do. In fact, they used to say that to me, too, and I never knew what it meant.
You're not yielding your time, are you?
No.
All right.
No, but I do think he's very, very knowledgeable on this topic. And I largely agree with him. I think that the most important relationship of the next 50 years is the American people and the Chinese people, which is not always the same as the two governments. There are times when we're going to have tension with an authoritarian regime for reasons that go to our core values. But we have to be very careful not to get involved in a long-term split in which the Chinese people conclude that we're their enemy. I mean, if the American and Chinese people are relatively positive towards each other, the planet will be vastly better than if we end up deciding inevitably in some kind of bipolar conflict. Second, I want to reinforce his point about manufacturing. The Boston Consulting Group did a study in August and said by 2015, South Carolina and Alabama will both be less expensive as centers of manufacturing than coastal China. That when you take total cost, not just labor costs. And so there's an opportunity here. The Chinese are becoming more expensive. We're becoming better at manufacturing once again. There's a chance that we will really modernize into genuine competition. There are a couple of big challenges for us that are partly military. If you take a map of the world, most of the campaigns we fight and plan to fight in Europe or in the Middle East are very short range. The Pacific is enormous. And this is a major problem in how we recapitalize our military. You need much longer-legged aircraft. You need much more naval power than we currently have. You need to really rethink how you're projecting power, because the objective requirements in Europe and in the Middle East are very short-legged and very immediate. And so you now have to really rethink how you're going to approach some of these things. Also, where on the one hand you're being pulled in, and the last Secretary of Defense, I think, overly pulled us into counterterrorism in terms of how we think about strategy and operations and investment. To deal with the Chinese, you have to recapitalize and modernize in the Navy, in the Air Force, in space, in cyber capability, and in electromagnetic pulse capability. So they're really very different requirements. And the challenge to us is to be able to do both of them. We've got to be very good at counterterrorism, and we've got to recapitalize and modernize to compete with the Chinese. But in the long run, to go back to a theme we started this afternoon with, if you don't fundamentally rethink what we're doing here, you cannot compete with China. If we do the right things here, China can't compete with us. But if we're determined to be domestically stupid, it is impractical to ask the Chinese to match us in stupidity. And so I'll give you just one or two quick examples. The Hart-Rudman report, which I helped create and Senator Rudman from New Hampshire helped chair, and I served on when I stepped down as Speaker, came back and said the greatest threat to the United States was a weapon of mass destruction going off in an American city, probably from a terrorist. said the second greatest threat to the United States in the next 25 years is our failure to modernize our education and invest in math and science and technology. And it went on to say that is a greater threat than any conceivable conventional war. Rebuilding the arsenal of democracy is unbelievably important, and that means you've got to rebuild the basic arsenal. I would also say that we have to look at doing our job and recognizing that in a very real way we owe it to the entire human race. I thought it was very telling when the president went to Brazil and told them how proud he was that they were drilling offshore. And he said, "We really want to be your best customer." And I thought he had it exactly backwards. We do not hire a president of the United States to go around the world to be a foreign purchasing agent. We hire the president of the United States to go around the world and be a salesman. And I think one of the places where the governor and I are in total agreement is we've ended the era when the sheer scale of the American economy allows us to help everybody else on the planet. And we've entered an era where, much like the Germans, we have to be thinking every morning about exports. We have to be thinking every morning about trade agreements. We have to be as sophisticated as any of our competitors. And that is an enormous change in both parties, Democrat and Republican, from where we have been. And it will require great institutional change in Washington to develop that attitude and execute it in a way that lets us remain the most powerful economy in the world.
Governor, I'm going to give you the last word on this, if we haven't covered it all.
Let me just throw this out, because I think this will be a critically important part of our engagement with China going forward, and that is taking it out of Washington and Beijing, where it has been for 40 years. The people live elsewhere. We have huge opportunities on a subnational basis to get governors and governors, mayors and mayors, principals and principals, entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs together. Because the driving force in China today isn't the party. It is their citizens who increasingly are able to access information about the world and who are driving conversation. This is a country with 500 million internet users, 80 million bloggers. I sat down at dinner a year or so ago with the top 12 bloggers in the country, 2 of whom had readerships each of 125 million. And they're driving conversations about political reform and human rights and religious tolerance and the role of the internet in society in ways that would have landed anyone in prison a few short years ago. So I say, what I want to do, I want to see more of what I was able to capture when I visited a high school, I think right outside of Bedford here, and visited the Chinese language program. They invited me in to talk to the students in Chinese, which was a lot of fun. And there was growing curiosity and interest, and just as the speaker mentioned, that people-to-people thing. We've got to keep something going that allows access, that allows opportunity, that allows the United States to continue doing what it always does well, and that's lead by its values. Because the world is still looking for our values, whether we recognize that or not, and our values still drive, shape, and mold events. Our values, they change history still, and I believe that in the chapters ahead in China, we will be responsible for some of the changes that take place because of the people-to-people interaction.
Well, gentlemen, we have gotten exactly halfway through our 10 points, which I think is pretty good, right? How about that? I think that's pretty good. Now, we're going to go to closing statements unless you guys would like to go for a quick lightning round of 5 questions. No, probably not.
No, we do that in those.
I understand. Debates. That was just joking.
Just don't ask a raise a hand question, that's all.
Yeah, no, we won't do that for sure. Why don't we go ahead to the closing statements then? Each have about 3 minutes. Take a little more, a little less, a little more. We begin with you, Speaker Gingrich.
Well, I just want to close sort of the way we started. I want to thank St. A's for doing this. I want to thank Governor Huntsman for chatting about it and agreeing to do it together. There weren't any gotcha moments. There weren't any efforts to trap each other. But I think people who look at the totality of this dialogue will agree that it's probably as sophisticated and as candid a discussion of America and the world as you've seen in any recent presidential campaign. And I want to thank the governor, who's extraordinarily knowledgeable, and I want to thank St. A's. This is what we should have a lot more of, because this is substantive. This is an effort. We're a country in enormous trouble, and we need leaders who are willing to talk with citizens at a pretty sophisticated level, because that's where we are. We're not going to solve these things with 30 seconds. What's your solution on Libya in 30 seconds? I mean, it's nutty. And this is not a Hollywood game. This is not a reality show. This is reality. And we are trying as a people to have a conversation to enable us to have this kind of future, that it solves our problems and brings us together. So this is why I've said if I do become the nominee, that I'll challenge the president to 7 3-hour debates, because I think this format is enormously helpful and allows you to really get things out you can't get out in those short bites. So I just want to thank all of you for participating and making this possible. And Governor, as always, I thank you for the kind of positive approach and the kind of knowledge you bring to bear on this.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. And for the good speaker to become the nominee, he's going to have to overcome our very formidable operation on the ground here in New Hampshire. Today, which was rolled out to the tune of, I don't know, 140 of our volunteer leaders in all 10 counties and 90 towns. Pretty remarkable. It's a great privilege to be here with the St. A's crowd. And Pat, thank you very much. Again, you know, this is the window, New Hampshire, this is the window through which the rest of the country gets to see, analyze, and assess the candidates running for the highest office in the land. You all punch above your weight. And when you make a decision come January 10th, the rest of the world looks and they ask how that happened, why it happened, and they tend to look at it and analyze it, because you have an opportunity to see the candidates up close and to experience these kinds of things. And I'm just honored and delighted that I've been able to participate in one that allows us to share some real ideas, some real thinking about America's role in the world. We got halfway through it, Pat. Maybe we can do another roundup with some of the other candidates if they dare show up, which I think would be a great. Which I think would be a great thing, and I can't wait to compare and contrast this format with the Donald Trump debate with the speaker in the coming days. But let me just close with this, Pat. The thing that has gone through my head as we've had this time together is, don't ever underestimate the extent that the light that emanates from the United States transforms the world. We are still 25% of the world's GDP. We still have the most productive worker on earth. We still have values that are the envy of the world: liberty, democracy, human rights, free markets. We still project that when we're strong. We're not strong today. And the world is a better place when America is strong. So I say, whatever happens, whoever becomes the nominee, may a good Republican go on to win, and may the first order of business in the area of foreign policy and national security priorities be fixing the core of this good country, because we deserve it as people. Thank you so very much.
This was a this was truly a great discussion, gentlemen, and we thank you for joining us. Mr. Speaker, whether you or Governor Huntsman are the nominee, this idea of challenging the president to 5 sort of like, how many, 7? I'll bet you $10,000 he doesn't show up. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us at St. Anselm College.
That was good.
That tells us who the real loser of yesterday was.
That's right.
Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Pat. It's a pleasure to be with you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
I just said to the governor, you just guaranteed who the real loser of this debate was.
I think he's got one more thing.
Oh, great. Thank you.
On behalf of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, welcome again. And the students, as I mentioned, are in exam, so they wanted to have the uniform of exam time.
Oh, terrific.
There we go. Yeah, might as well give them the St. A's picture.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in.